Welcome to the Movement DAO podcast. I'm Felix Ander. This is our third episode, and we're here with Devin from Abracadabra Films to talk about some ocean conservation and specifically an issue that's very big in the Florida coast right now with red tide. Devin, how are you doing today?
It is a pleasure and an honor to be here. I love your show. I listened to the first couple episodes, and I'm really excited for all the awesome stuff you guys are doing with, creating some positive change in the world.
Yeah, thank you very
Thank you
much.
for having me.
Oh, I appreciate it. I appreciate it. I'm excited to talk to you. So you're working on a documentary, and you're doing this in an arena that we're going to call Film 3. That's a new term a lot of people probably are not familiar with, and it deals with a very important cause that's important but also near and dear to your heart. So can you give us a short rundown on your project and where you're at right now?
Sure. I'm a native Floridian. I got into the film industry after being a performer and moved on the backside of the camera and spent a lot of time in Los Angeles. But just like a lot of people during the pandemic, I moved back to Florida and continued to work remotely. And while I was here, this environmental disaster at Piney Point occurred. And that's when a storage facility for radioactive phosphate gypsum, and we can get into what that is, failed. And they had to dump, let me rephrase that. They chose to dump millions and millions of gallons of radioactive material into Tampa Bay. And that spread and caused the flourishing of red tide, which is a bacteria that kills marine life of all different kinds and sizes, and also is harmful to humans. Like makes people very sick. You can smell it in the air. The tide itself, the water looks red. So I started documenting this just for my own records and just to have it, in to use in some later date. And over the course of several months, started doing investigative journalism on this topic. And I found that there was more to this story than meets the eye. And this is a place where I grew up fishing, sailing, diving, enjoying the environment, being a proponent of conservation and really like wanting to shepherd this beautiful state, the elements of this beautiful state environmentally that we have to the next generation. And here in lo and behold, we find that not only our politicians and our government appointed officials in departments like the EPA and other departments are not mitigating this to what I think and what others think are the correct and best standards. But we found that a lot of this has been a result of a hedge fund that came from New York City and led by a gentleman who Forbes calls the vulture of Wall Street. And their whole business model is to target companies that are on the verge of bankruptcy, squeeze all the resources out of them, and then file bankruptcy and leave it for the local citizens to deal with and the local governments to deal with. They've been fined millions of dollars in other parts of the US for this. And that's what really lit a fire under me to be like, this isn't even necessarily us doing this. I mean, granted, the locals like are responsible for mitigating and solving the problem, but all of this could have been avoided. And this is a lesson that if we share this story of how and why we got here, we can certainly prevent it from happening in the future. But one of the reasons I decided to do a documentary and incorporate Film 3 and Web 3 is not only to inspire a younger generation to take up actionable causes and prove that they could do it from a crowdsourcing, local, grounded, minimalistic, and expand and scale from there. It was also to, it was to show that there's solutions to these problems that people don't really know about. One of my biggest frustrations with traditional documentaries is that how often do you see a documentary and it's like, oh, this problem is bad, the world is bad, these things are messed up, the end. That's so
Right.
unrewarding.
Right.
I just felt like, hey, if we're going to do this, if we're going to tell this story, we got to provide solutions, because the same eyeballs that are going to be watching this topic and hearing about it that is going to cause a political and policy change also can promote these new technology solutions to get us out of this mess. And it's really difficult for those new technology solutions to shine when there's just billions and billions of dollars from the agricultural and the phosphate industries you know, basically preventing that and, keeping this monopoly and keeping the, status quo from, the 1950s. This is a problem that's 70 plus years old, and it's not going to go away unless we do something about it.
Yeah, yeah. And so just there's a lot to unpack there. So we'll go through this in stages. But Piney Point is a phosphate plant. It's on the west coast of Florida in Manatee County. And just to give people a sense of the timeline, this really happened. This specific thing really happened in April of last year. So we're talking about April and March 2021. That's just shy over a year ago. Caused an evacuation that and a state of emergency issuance by the Florida governor. So it's a big deal, and I think most people, have not heard of this. So let's talk about why was this phosphate plant there in Florida, and how did it get to the point that you had things pumped into the water that were detrimental and causing environmental damage?
Yeah, of course. So phosphate is actually one of Florida's biggest industrial products. We produce 25% of the world's fertilizer and 75% of America's fertilizer. So Florida is literally responsible for feeding the country and feeding the world. I mean, in a one step, two-step removed indirect manner, but still, it's a heavy lift, and that's a faucet that can't just be turned off without serious repercussions.
Sure.
But because of that, they have a lot of leverage, and this plant in the industry really flourished and developed from the 1940s and 50s. This particular plant, Piney Point, was shut down and not producing phosphate, or let me rephrase that. The storage facility of Piney Point was shut down decades and decades ago, in the late 60s, early 70s. And since then, it's just been sitting. In the way they store the byproduct of making fertilizer, which is phosphate gypsum. So phosphate is mined, they convert that into fertilizer, and then the byproduct is stored in what's called a gypsum stack. A gypsum stack is basically a big pond with a liner on the bottom. And the byproduct, the gypsum, is a sand. It's a radioactive sand. And they put all that sand in this big dugout pond on top of the liner, and then they put water on top of it so the sand doesn't blow away.
And that's a
So
contaminant.
it's been
That's
sitting like
right.
this for decades with the intention of it being closed, actually 10 years ago. And, hopefully, they claim they wanted to close it in the 90s, but, that just never happened. And every, policy and government kind of, individuals have been kicking the can down the road since then. So
So it's just been
they,
sitting there.
yeah, it's just been sitting there. And there's 24 of these all around the state right now. And they're all very antiquated technology of the way that they were built, 80 years ago.
Sure.
So they're inevitably going to fail. And they're trying to figure out different solutions of how to mitigate this, because the problem isn't going to go away. But meanwhile, there's not really a push and incentive to fix it until one of these disasters happens. But by then, of course, the damage is done and it's too late. So, you mentioned that there was an evacuation and a state of emergency. So the storage facility sits very, very close to the actual open water of Tampa Bay, and it is just south of a giant ecological preserve. It is in the port of Manatee, which is an industrial port. And right next to there is the county jail and a bunch of other county facilities, as well as residential property and stuff. So they chose to direct this flow of water in toxic water that had the gypsum in it into the bay using trenches and pipes, instead of allowing it to flood the property of the surrounding areas, because they would have to shut down this port. They would have to relocate all the members of this county jail. It would cost them a lot, and there would be a lot of lawsuits, obviously, from private landowners because of that.
Of
So
course.
to mitigate the cost of them being sued for dealing with this, and they had to deal with it soon, they just dumped over 215 million gallons of this toxic waste into Tampa Bay over the course of a couple weeks.
Wow.
And, obviously it got really bad press blowback, but what we saw is, basically they're dumping radioactive fertilizer into the bay. And red tide is a bacteria that naturally occurs in Florida and other parts of the world. And it is, comes and goes with the season and the water temperature. And it's usually not a large area. It's usually very localized, and it's usually not in high volume of a fish kill. Like something could be a few square miles, maybe less. But in this
And just to
case,
be clear,
the
red tide
fertilizer was
is
acting as
an
fuel for that
right, and
to
red
grow.
tide is a algae that seasonally can come on sometimes, and it is a toxin that in high enough quantities can kill fish and can harm humans, particularly our respiratory tracts. But generally, red tide is not at that high level, right?
Yeah, I should clarify my terminology. So red tide is the algae, but the algae creates a toxic bacteria within the marine life. And then
Got it.
that bacteria is what kills the marine life and then produces neurotoxins. So, people say red tide is a blanket term, as both the algae and the bacteria as the result of the algae. So it's kind of like, it's used ambiguously between the two.
Right. And so kind of you almost had a perfect storm here where there's red tide that occurs naturally, but now you've dumped a lot of radioactive fertilizer literally to create conditions to grow something like red tide. Right? I mean, this is kind of the perfect storm that intersected here in this case.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And something that is normally, a few, tens or maybe even 100 acres as far as size for a red tide bloom in a normal season became everything in Tampa Bay and as far north as Clearwater and as far south as Fort Myers. Because of the way the Gulf Stream and the currents work, that once you get out of Tampa Bay, the currents go from the north to the south. So it would flow out of Tampa Bay and really turn southward and just devastate all the marine life south as well. That's when we were noticing dump trucks worth of dead fish washing up on beaches and being floated around in every canal, every big floating patches in the middle of the bay. And you could just, not only could you see it, but you could smell it. You would breathe in these neurotoxins, and it
Yeah,
would
what a
really affect
disaster.
everybody's life from day to day. But not only that, but all the businesses, all the commercial fishermen, what we export as commercial fish. Like, this thing touches everyone in Florida's life who lives on the coast and who lives inland, truthfully, because some of these phosphate stacks are not on the coast. They're inland in the state, and Florida sits on a giant aquifer. So if those things fail, or if there's runoff from a hurricane or a big storm, or high water levels increase and overflow, that's going into our water supply.
Yeah,
And
and
these are just
right.
topics that people don't know about.
And to hop in here, I mean, as I was doing a little research on red tide, if there's a bad red tide, they say that if the breeze just comes off the ocean on shore, people start getting a little choked up, and they can feel, they can feel some discomfort in their respiratory tract. So it's serious business. I mean, especially if this has now kind of been exponentially grown by this
Yeah,
by this disaster, right? And according to your site here, see 3.2 million pounds of dead fish were removed specifically from Paez County beaches alone, which is bonkers.
the Pinellas County is St. Petersburg. So yeah, that's the peninsula of
Got it.
Tampa Bay if you're looking at a map. And that's just from those beaches.
Right.
So that's not including all the dead fish that were just floating in the water, which were accumulating. In when the tide comes in, they'll go up into the canals and up into nooks and crannies of seawalls and stuff. And when the tide goes out, all that's moved out into open water in the Gulf.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. That's just insane. So, what was the I mean, what was the reaction to this? When did they put the pieces together that this colossal algae bloom, this red tide, was really being fed by this gypsum phosphate dump?
So for every study that, and this is a challenge that we've had to deal with the documentary, is the scientific studies behind this and who is financing the scientists and the studies, because it's similar to the cigarette industry, to where every study that you see that associates the two of red tide and phosphate gypsum, you'll find another one that does not associate them.
Right.
So there's been a lot of money from big phosphate industry companies to propagate and say this is not what the cause of this is. But we've had independent labs and independent scientists that have really done some hard research and connected those dots to where the science and the data shows that it's unequivocally it's not the cause of red tide, but it is the cause of this large bloom of red tide. And one of the other things is that the media and the powers that be don't really want to lean into the fact that this is a radioactive material. The radiominute decays from phosphate from this byproduct over a certain period of time, and that is why that it had to be stored in these stacks. Previously, this byproduct was used for different construction materials like building roads, building concrete in houses, or in buildings that weren't really heavily trafficked or people weren't living in them. But during the 70s and 80s, the EPA came along and said, "Hi, hey, these radioactive levels are not safe for humans. So you can't use them for these other byproducts. You have to put it in these stacks." Well, now they're saying this isn't radioactive at all, including the governor. And, you can say what we want about the governor and the head of agriculture. I love them both for different reasons. And I'm hoping to get both of them in this documentary. I have some connections with them, and I think that this is a bipartisan issue that we don't need to fight about on a political sense. But I think that they're under pressure from the phosphate industries to not share the full story with the public. And, meanwhile, while all this sand is basically being dumped into the bay, it's sand going into water. So it'll float around for a little bit, but eventually it settles. And we've taken water samples and sand samples from the seafloor in Madeira Beach, which is right in Pinellas County. It's like in the middle of that peninsula. And safe levels are something around 7 to 10 parts per million. And as of November and December of 2021, it was registering about 270 parts per million. And meanwhile, you have millions of tourists coming here over the year, swimming in that water. You have fish being harvested for that water for recreation, for eating and consumption, as well as commercial catches. And that commercial catch is being put on fish markets and sold to like resorts in Aspen and other places and exported out of the state. And just like there's microplastics in everything now, this is such small particles. And once it gets in the food supply on a plankton and a nutrient level for different seaweeds that the fish eat, it gets into the fish as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that that's an important point to make because for environmental causes, you always have, from the most cynical attitude as well. There's so many things to care about in the world. Why am I caring about, algae when X, Y, and Z is happening? I feel like there's an easy sell here when you think of the ramifications of this, and particularly that there's still so many of these stacks that were put there decades ago that are deteriorating, that are potentially failing, and that could not only contaminate Florida but also all these tourism trends, as you say, that come in that are exposed to this. It certainly seems like a pressing problem that it's an easy sell in terms of getting buy-in for. So on your end, so now let's switch this into Web3 because you obviously have this very unique approach. And for those of you listening, if you want to check out the trailer for this, it's abracadabrafilms.com, and there's a hyphen abracadabra films.com. You can check out the trailer for this documentary. But the idea really is that you're going to leverage some Web3 technologies and try to highlight this problem, but also provide some solutions. So can you give us a little rundown of, well, first of all, where you're at in this process and how Web3 technologies specifically are going to help you with this?
Yeah, absolutely. And just the last point I think is important to drive home is this is a ticking time bomb
Right,
because there are 24 other of these stacks, and all it's going to take is one hurricane to let them all fail at the
right.
same time. And this was just one failing without a hurricane during the spring, during a dry season. So I think that time is of the essence in that sense as a way to mitigate these problems. And, before we get into film three, I really, in the documentary, we have 3 acts. We tell the history, where we're at now, what this problem is, and then focusing on solutions and new technology. And we've found 2 companies so far. We're searching for a third that is going to create and invent new solutions, technologies, and environmental engineering solutions for these problems. One of them is Anomalous Industries, and they've come up with a bunch of patents. And I actually met the CEO Trevor Com at a protest, and he just happened to come by and started pulling out all these inventions in front of the news camera and was like, "I'm sick and tired of this. I'm releasing these patents. Here you go. You want to solve this problem? Take this. This does X, Y, and Z. Bam, that's a solution. Here's another one. Bam." So it's really encouraging and inspirational to see a lot of these people wanting to jump on board. So if we're going to point a spotlight at the problem, we also need to point a spotlight at the solutions. And that's what we're doing with the documentary as a whole. The other company is hempforwater.org. They grow hemp plants on floating flotillas in Lake Okeechobee, and they've actually been financed with grants from the state. And these hemp plants grow hydroponically with the root systems going directly down into the water. But hemp, because of its nature, absorbs not only the nitrogen and the phosphate, but it also absorbs that radioactive byproduct, and it converts it and breaks it down. So then you can use that hemp for different textiles and things like that. Obviously, you wouldn't use it for human consumption, but you would use it for basically everything else, which
Sure.
hemp is a very versatile product. So with the reason I decided to use film three, is what we're calling web three in film, is because first of all, I think the whole film industry is going to shift towards this new technology in the first place. But in this particular instance, I wanted to demonstrate to anybody out there around the world that you don't need a film studio with millions of dollars to really tell a story like this that's emotional, that's impacting, and provide solutions. You can do this from the ground up. And it's going to take work. It takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of teams. But at the same time, the technology is there that now enables us to not only tell this story, but also continue it. And after the documentary is released, we can use this technology to continue to fund different inventions and solutions and continue to inspire new generations to keep this train going. So I think of it as a very, very valuable and interesting tool that never has existed before, the way we can crowdsource conservation. And I think that that to me was the most important element of the film three aspect of this, because I could have gone to plenty of my film investors and just said, hey, it's going to cost this much money to do this doc. We have connections at the major streaming services. I've already put films on Netflix and Hulu and HBO, and that's not the issue. I think that for me, it's more important to show the kid in high school or college right now that doesn't have those connections, that say, hey, or even somebody on a different continent that doesn't have those resources, say, hey, in the digital world, you can find help and you can find a group of people that will band together to not only help with the immediate cause, but continue providing solutions. And that was the inspiration for me to get into film three, particularly with this documentary.
Yeah, and that's awesome. So, what would some of the salient differences be between that traditional route where you get investors, the investors take generally, a producer credit in some cases, you get that starting capital, you make the documentary go through distribution. How does, and obviously some people also do this, they hop on a Kickstarter and try to self-fund a movie. Where are the Web3 differences in terms of what you're able to do when you want to make a documentary or a film?
So the Web3 differences are using smart contracts and the sale of artwork related to the documentary and inspired by the documentary as a way to finance the production. A traditional method would be a handful or a couple companies would come together, finance a project. You would produce that project, principal photography, edit, and then sell it to a distributor. Or sometimes you would have a pre-sale and arrange that before you even start rolling cameras. And then all the investors would get paid back after that sale. That's the traditional model. Well, with this, we thought, hey, we can partner with artists that are up and coming and established, and we can raise the money needed to finance the film using the sale of art in different mediums of art, not just, digital art, but music, actual short clips of films. Photography is a big one. And by raising the capital that way, we're not beholden to pay back the investors. So we'll just, from Abracadabra Films perspective, we're not out to make money on this. So when we sell to a distributor, we're going to put all of that, or 50% of that revenue from the sale, into a DAO that we're hoping to create. And we were putting a percentage of all the NFT sales into the DAO. And that DAO will then be able to decide what to do with that money. And the goal of that DAO, the mission statement, is to fund solutions in nonprofits or environmental engineering companies in grants or in just donations that are really doing something innovative in the space, that aren't just doing the same things that we've always done. They could be using Web3, they could be using new computer and advanced technologies, new AI, or they could just be using natural technologies. I think one of the big things in traditional industrial era is, hey, we created this chemical dumped into the environment, so we're going to create another chemical to mitigate the chemical.
Right.
And the world, nature has so many solutions to mitigate these problems without us having to really come up with it in a lab. Now, I think that there's the value of using science and engineering those solutions to specific needs. And that's kind of the direction we wanted to focus on and highlight those companies and those nonprofits that are doing that kind of work. Moat Marine is a really great marine and aquarium here in Manatee County. They've done incredible work. They partnered with us. We're hoping to get a lot of their leading scientists, and because of this red tide spill or this red tide bloom and the Piney Point spill, they've created a red tide division specifically set to invent solutions for mitigating these problems using natural solutions like clays, different sands, and different absorbent materials that I don't want to give away any of their
Right.
proprietary
Right.
stuff, but
It's all right.
the
It's
whole
it's
point is
just
to
just a
not use more
podcast. You can give
chemicals
it
to
up.
clean up chemicals. Yeah.
Yeah, no, so I think that's awesome. So on one hand, you also have with the NFT sale, you have the provenance nailed down, right? If somebody bought something from your documentary, they can obviously prove immediately that they own that piece of this process, which is exciting. On your end as well, what I'm curious is to learn more about some of these high impact social directions. And I think the idea of the DAO that can then drive high social impact causes is terrific. One thing I read, maybe you can talk a little bit about, is you're going to go into education by creating a little scholarship and kind of a contest opportunity for elementary, middle, and high school. I think that's absolutely phenomenal. Can you give us a little rundown of what that will look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a teacher for a brief period of time. I taught musical theater in high school, but that inspired me to always try to educate. And my goal in life is to entertain and educate. So one of the things I wanted to do is, how can we give back? How can we inspire kids that are up and coming? I remember when I was a kid, I was always looking for, we have a thing here in Florida called Nature's Classroom. So in public school, you would go out into nature and spend time there on a field trip at public parks, at different watersheds and water resources, just so you as a resident would have a familiarity with the environment. And I think
That's
that's very
awesome.
important.
Yeah, that's
So
awesome.
one of the things that we want to do is take some of the resources from this film, from not only the sale, but also the sale of these NFTs, and create a basically a science fair contest. So we'll have elementary kids, middle school kids, and high school kids in those three categories, and ask them to come up with their own solutions for red tide or for phosphate gypsum pollution. And obviously, some of the elementary and middle school kids will probably be a little bit more simple, or maybe we just include them as being conservation in general, whether it's pollution and plastic on the beach or anything like that. And we'll have some higher thresholds for the high school kids and beyond, because we want to inspire them to come up with solutions on their own and keep doing that in life. Well, how do we do that other than just giving somebody a shiny trophy or a gold medal? Is we set aside money for grants for them to fund their further education. So I think that if you are in high school and you are kayaking and now you can't kayak for 6 months because there's all these problems, you don't sit around and woe in it. You can think and use your brain and use your creativity and do something about it, and you will be rewarded for that action. I think rewards and incentivizing action based on rewards is a big thing. It's motivation of human nature. So I don't want to just give some 18-year-old kid a bag of money, but I do want to help pay for them to go to college to get their degree in science or technology.
Certainly, certainly. And so just to wrap things up, where are you at now in the process? Of course, your site is Abracadabra Films with a hyphen .com, but are you in pre-sale, or for audience members that want to learn more about your project, where should they go and what do you want to tell them?
So yeah, absolutely. I've already started principal photography, so filming is underway. Filming began last year when the environmental disaster happened, and we've been getting interviews, testimonials, as well as scientific studies and things like that, slowly developing. But we have 2 rounds of NFT sales. We have 95 limited one-of-one pieces on OpenSea right now. The floor price is anywhere from 0.03 ETH all the way up to 1 ETH. And the higher price points of those one of ones give utility. You'll be allocated tokens from the DAO. You'll be invited to different events, and you'll have a say in what happens in this project and how it comes to fruition. Act two, as we're calling it, otherwise like a phase two, would be a generative drop. So as soon as Act one and all of our 95 limited one of one sell out, we have our smart contracts being developed right now. And we have artists developing art for a generative drop, and we'll do a 10,000 piece generative drop, and that will provide utility as well in DAO tokens, as well as other perks and benefits, seeing the movie, invited to the live events, other kind of hidden things that we're developing. And the Act Two is basically going to fund the principal photography and the DAO. So once we have the generative drop out and released, we have a certain number that we need to sell. And once we hit that threshold, it's not all 10,000 pieces. So don't worry, we're still moving forward without having that heavy lift. I understand that most generative drops don't reach that goal.
Right.
So we wanted to offer these NFTs because we know the value of them is going to increase once the project gets made and distributed. So it's one thing to own a one-of-one artwork or a generative drop with rarity and scarcity mechanics. That has value in and of itself. But it's another thing to own one that is tied and associated with a documentary that's going on Netflix or Hulu or HBO or Paramount or wherever it lives. I mean, that right there is where I think the film 3 aspect kind of ties into this and saying not only is there utility, but these values can increase depending on the success and popularity of the project. I mean, if this project exerts a political change in the state and affects policy on a national level, because the storage of this gypsum is a national EPA federal policy. So if we're changing laws on a big scale and we're influencing policy in other countries or other elements, I mean, that's like best case scenario. But I
Sure.
mean, just think about what that means to be on the ground floor and owning one of these one of ones or even one of the generative ones. I mean, it's exciting to be a part of it. It's exciting to do something that's more than just a investment of scarcity and rarity mechanics and value in that sense. It's a whole nother thing when you add this layer of like, we're doing actual good in the world and we can prove that tangibly. And you can be a part of that journey with us. And it doesn't have to stop at the documentary. It's going to keep going. And I think that's the real exciting thing for me. So if you want to help us and you want to support now, you can go to OpenSea and you can search Abracadabra Films. There's a link on the Abracadabra Films website. We have a tab called Blood in the Water is the name of the documentary. So you can go click on Blood in the Water, and down below the roadmap, there'll be an OpenSea link for our limited collection. That is also where we're going to mint the generative collection when that happens. But I think also too, if you want to share this and if you just want to help and tell the story, and I know, everybody's in different places with their lives in the market right now, awareness and creating, the team and the community around this is absolutely essential. And that is what is going to demonstrate to the kid in Iowa or the kid in, Africa or South America that has their own problem and their own story to tell about their own environmental issue, that they don't need millions of dollars from some VC or some NGO to come in and save the day. You can do it from the ground up. You can do it yourself. And we're going to prove that now. And that's why I'm so passionate about this, man. I think it's one of the, I've done a lot of fun things in my life. I've been in Hollywood for a lot of years. And this is one of the things I'm very, very passionate about. And I think it's one of the most important things I've done, truthfully.
Yeah, 100%. And I do want to thank you for coming on and sharing the story and for just getting awareness on this cause. I mean, as we've been talking about it, it's important. And literally, I've never met anyone who heard of this or knows anything about this, at least here on the West Coast. So I really appreciate you being here, Devin. Once again, Abracadabra Films, guys, search it up if you want to learn more about the story. And we'll also link, of course, as we drop the podcast. But thank you so much for being here. And I look forward to getting updates as you continue on in your journey.
Yeah, and if anyone listening would like to follow or reach out, you can find me personally on Twitter at Abracadabra Dev.
Awesome.
Abracadabra is spelled like it sounds, and DEV. So that's my name. So yeah, feel free to reach out, send me a DM, share, promote, help, whatever you want, man. I'll be, right back there with you, and we can go on this journey together, trying to save a planet. Captain Planet, baby.
Captain Planet. All right. Thank you, Devin. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. The honor and the pleasure is mine. I'm really excited for what you guys are doing, and I'm going to promote you guys on all of my podcasts and radio shows as well. So thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. All right, guys. Thank you for joining for another episode of the Movement DAO podcast. This time it was with Devin from Abracadabra Films. And take care. We'll see you next time.